We are moving right along to our last presenter. I think Nate's been last a couple years in a row because he's so good and we know people are going to wait for him. And that's why he's last. No other reason, Nate. The Southern Maine Office Forecast, Nate Stevens, CBRE, the Booles Company.
Thank you, Paul. Wow, we are way ahead of schedule. Usually going last, I get gypped on the time, but I do have my 40-minute version of this presentation ready to go, so bear with me. No, I actually ran through this in front of my 5-year-old son earlier this week, and about 2.5 minutes into it, he's just like, ugh, what are you talking about? So at least it prepared me for distraction, so if any of you, play with Legos or fall out of your chair and roll around the ground or spill milk, I'm well prepared for that. But anyway, thank you to MEREDA for this opportunity once again to get up here and give you the 2018 Southern Maine Office Forecast. So this is the 4th year that I've been doing this forecast. So really been digging into the office market over those years. And hopefully we'll be able to give you a little bit of insight in terms of what to expect 2018, 2019 and beyond, but also take a quick snapshot at what happened over the last 12 months. So a lot of the data I'm going to present to you today is information gathered at CBRE, the Booles Company, as part of our annual market outlook. We just released our 22nd edition this morning, so make sure you get your hands on it. We really dig into the office market in that market outlook, but touches on a lot of different aspects of commercial real estate. So please check that out before you head out today. So in this market outlook, we survey 341 Class A and Class B buildings in Greater Portland, which is split into these 7 submarkets, as you see here, including medical office space. And in 2017, there was almost 200,000 square feet of new construction and space that was added to our total market, so just over 12 million square feet for the first time. And it's a relatively small market, so really one large transaction can sway the numbers one way or the other, so I'll be sure to kind of point that out as we move through. But this is just a quick list of the projects that made up that new construction last year. 4 in total. One of them in downtown Portland, 16 Middle Street, 42,000 square feet. I talked about extensively last year as the first significant office building in downtown Portland in 10 years. But then 3 fairly large occupier-driven projects in the suburban market, and 2 in Yarmouth, which is fairly incredible. So as we move through, I'll let you know what we can expect for new construction, because I think that'll be an integral part of our market moving forward. So let's dig into the numbers. The total direct market vacancy rate, that doesn't include sublease space, in 2017 was 4.41%. This is down considerably from 2016, which was about 6.1%. And it is the 7th consecutive year for a drop in the vacancy rate for Greater Portland office market, so definitely a slow and steady recovery. And the last few years, I've also talked about how we've been inching towards this, pre-recession vacancy rates, and we definitely hit that in 2017, as this was the lowest vacancy rate since 2006. So with that significant drop in the vacancy rate, there was also a positive net absorption of 363,000 square feet. So net absorption is really just the amount of square footage that's occupied today versus the same time last year. So there's 363,000 more square feet occupied today than there was last year. To really kind of put this number in perspective, the last 4 years, from 2012 to 2016, totaled 380,000 square feet. And then even the years before that, it was negative absorption with climbing vacancy rates. So definitely a lot of movement in the marketplace last year. And then something that really started happening in 2016 and certainly continued through 2017 was just a very, very low supply on the market. And I think we've heard a few other folks talk about that today, but not a lot of options for tenants in the market. Really 3 primary options that stand for maybe those larger companies over 10,000 square feet, especially Class A, which is extremely limited. But really your options were, maybe a reorganization of the office space, fewer private offices, more open area, to be able to add a few more employees as part of your growth plan, or maybe opening a satellite location. This was pretty popular in downtown Portland with quickly growing companies opening up maybe a 5,000 or 10,000 square foot space across the street. And then really the last option is new construction. And new construction is a good 12 to 18 months out, and it's also roughly 50% more expensive than existing product. So right now, and especially through 2017, not a lot of great options for quickly growing companies in Greater Portland. And then the last few years I've talked about, okay, you have this dropping vacancy rate, your lease rates are steadily increasing, we're certainly getting to a tenant or a landlord's market. And that's definitely the case in Class A. But that never really just seemed to come to fruition last year in Class B as I was hoping or expecting, I guess. So, in the tenant market, the vacancy rates are a little higher. There are more options for them to choose from. More tenant incentives such as free rent or tenant improvement monies, things of that nature. So there's this talk of this big drop in the vacancy rate, high positive net absorption, low supply. I guess you could make the case that this is the strongest market that we've seen in maybe the last 10 to 15 years, or at least office market. But last year, the transaction volume decreased considerably. And really, the transaction volume is just the number of leases that are signed over the course of the last 12 months as reported to the Press Herald. But I think what it speaks to is demand. And demand through 2017 appeared to be very, very low. And I just don't think that's because of a low supply. Speaking with a lot of brokers and landlords here in the room across all submarkets, there just weren't as many tenants on the street. There weren't as many showings. Buildings that you think would fill a lot quicker just kind of sat out there for a longer period of time. And this is in Class A and Class B product. And what's interesting is I've been tracking the transaction volume for the last 10 years. And 2017 had the fewest number of leases signed out of all of those 10 years. So even in 2011, 2012, and 2013, during the Great Recession, when those vacancy rates were pushing 12%, there were more leases being signed than there were last year. So I think what that means right now, you have this very, very low supply, you have a very, very low demand, and we have a very balanced market, which isn't all that different for Greater Portland, but it just means a lot of inactivity in the marketplace. So really, how can you have this big drop in the vacancy rate, but also fewer transactions? And I think I'll show you as we move through this, but it was just a few large transactions that really shaped the market last year. And we'll talk about those in a little bit. As I mentioned in my previous slide, there was new construction that came to fruition, was added to the market last year, and I'll point out as we move through what to expect in the next couple years. So to really see maybe where this large drop in the vacancy rate came from, I mean, it's a 25% drop. I don't think we've seen a drop like this in the vacancy rate in a very long time. This is a slide that has two graphs, which shows vacancy rates over the last 6 years. And you have downtown Portland on your left, suburban markets on your right, including medical. Class B buildings are represented by the light blue line, and Class A is the dark, or Class A office space is the dark green line. And starting in downtown Portland, as you can see over the last few years, 2014, 2015, really the market driver for the drop in those vacancy rates was really due to entirely downtown Portland, especially in the Class A market. But if you look over the course of the last 12 months, not a whole lot of movement in that Class B, just a very, very slight decrease. And actually the Class A market increased a little bit last year. So, when we talk about the, 16 Middle Street, 42,000 square feet getting added to the market last year, I just don't think that the market could absorb that new space added to the market last year downtown. But when you move out to the suburban market, especially over the course of the last 12 months, you can see very, very sharp drops in both Class A and Class B properties. So when we talk about that 25% drop in the vacancy rate or 360,000 square feet of positive net absorption, that was almost entirely due to suburban submarkets. So to move through, really kind of pinpoint exactly what properties made up that movement. These are significant transactions in downtown Portland over 10,000 square feet. In previous years, I've had 6, 7, 8, 9 transactions. Last year, there were only 2, I think really speaking towards a lack of activity in downtown Portland. Obviously, the biggest one is the headline grabber, WEX signing a lease for 90,000 square feet to kick off a 100,000 square foot building on Hancock Street, and I'll talk about that a little bit longer, but really interesting project in terms of a large corporate company moving to the urban center and part of this urban migration that we're seeing a lot throughout the country. And then the other large transaction was actually a sublease at One Monument Square, Certify leasing about 13,000 square feet. And Certify could be this example of a quickly growing local company. They have another location, and this is a second location to really just help that quick growth, absorb that quick growth. There are also a few other transactions. When I say significant transactions, that could be a sale or a lease that has an effect on the absorption. And a couple significant transactions last year that aren't on our survey but could possibly affect the market moving forward. One of them would be Baxter Academies, which is a local charter school relocated from their 15,000 square foot facility on York Street into a 33,000 square foot space, 185 Lancaster in the Bayside Complex, a deal that Joe Porta and I put together. And what could happen with that is their old facility is now under contract. Maybe it's closed already, where the developer is considering renovating that to office space. So that is certainly something that could be added to the market in the next 12 months or so. But also where Baxter Academies moved into, there were a number of small tenants that had to be relocated in order to make that much space available. And that essentially filled the Bayside Complex, really taking away that low-cost option in downtown Portland. So maybe even pushing that demand up towards the lower end of the Class B properties, Congress Street, and Monument Square area. So we'll see how that affects it moving forward. This is also typically where I talk about significant renewals, but in 2017, there really weren't any in downtown Portland. There were a few large transactions, AMEC at 511 Congress, which just signed recently, as well as Model N, but that's really it for 2017 downtown. But moving into the suburban market, I know this is a lot to look at, but this really just makes the point in terms of where the activity was. There are 7 significant transactions, both sales and leases, owner-occupied sales in the suburban market. And really the largest deal of the year happening in Westbrook, Maine Health purchasing One Riverfront Plaza, 134,000 square feet. What's interesting is that the last few years I've had to give this warning that, hey, by the way, there's this one big vacancy in Westbrook that's really skewing the numbers. Well, kind of on the opposite end, I'm saying that there's one big deal in Westbrook that's skewing the numbers. A lot's happening in downtown Westbrook right now. This building, though, when you talk about that 363,000 square feet of positive net absorption, this is more than 1/3 of the activity that happened last year. But even beyond that, there's still, a number of leases in that 20 to 30,000 square foot range, especially in the Maine Mall area. So you have 30,000 square feet leased to Wex on Darling Avenue. Right around the corner, Intermed leased 24,000 square feet on Foden Road, and across the street from that, Maine Health leasing 20,000 square feet on Western Avenue. So a lot of activity in the Maine Mall area. And then in addition, Clark Insurance leased 25,000 square feet as part of a 2-building development at the Elks across from the airport. So, when you really dig down into the activity last year, it's certainly in the suburban market, as I mentioned earlier, but specifically Westbrook, thanks to that one large transaction, but also the Maine Mall area, really taking the bulk of the activity. The other way to look at this, too, is that 75% of the square footage on this screen was leased or purchased by medical-related companies, 4 out of these 7 transactions. So really digging into it, the medical office market really drove those vacancy rates down in 2017, and I'll get into what we could expect on that front, too, moving forward. This is where I quickly just kind of go into some of maybe the significant office investment sales, and I'm not going to get into these, I don't have the time to get into these specifically, but really only 3 significant over $5 million sales in office-related sales in Greater Portland last year. This doesn't talk necessarily exactly to vacancy rates, but there were a couple large transactions, 284 Street selling for $21,500,000, 82 Running Hill Road, also $17,900,000, and then a smaller deal at 63 Marginal Way, all Class A product. There is a very, very high demand, I think, as you've heard other folks talk about today, for investment-related product. And really, in the last few years, there have been many more properties and deals on this slide, but the lack of activity in that market is really just due to the supply and certainly not the demand. And I don't think it was the case with these 3 buildings, but on a smaller scale, that $1 to $5 million range, properties that sold were multiple offers, selling the day they came on the market, even if they went to the market. So I certainly see that demand continuing, at least for the near term in 2018. I think whether we see any significant transactions really has to do with whether the supply is going to come up here. But there are a couple that are in the works, and so we'll see if those come to fruition. So really what to expect moving into 2018. As I mentioned, new construction I think will play a big part in where our vacancy rates go in the long term. And this is a slide that I developed last year, which really just simply shows the correlation between low vacancy rates and new construction. And this is downtown Class A vacancy rates over the last 22 years. And every time that vacancy rate would go below 4% and stay below 4%, there'd be new construction. There was obviously a much longer period of time between 1998 and 2004, a short little period in 2007, but we're in one of those periods right now in downtown Portland. So even despite that slight increase in the Class A market last year, we're still below 4% threshold, which means I think we're going to continue seeing new construction in downtown Portland. So far, this includes projects that have broken ground. There's about 172,000 square feet added to the downtown market. And I think for 2018, we're going to see that continue. I'm not seeing anything that's really going to push that vacancy rate up over 4%, at least for the next 12 months. Maybe something a little different beyond that. So I think we will see continued new construction in downtown Portland. And this is a list of buildings that are under construction, they've broken ground, they're ready to go, they will be added to our marketplace. All 4 of them in Portland, 3 of them in downtown Portland. I think last year I'd said that if we can stay below 4%, we'll add a few more buildings in downtown Portland, and that was certainly the case. One of those we made by just maybe a month or so, but totaling about 170,000 square feet. So I think if a building hasn't broken ground now, it's probably not going to make it into 2018. But that being said, we're still at possibly the same rate as we saw last year, that 190,000 square feet, which is still a considerable amount. I mean, that's the most amount of square footage we've seen built in Greater Portland in over 10 years, but it's not really nearly averaging what we were in the early 2000s, which was about 300,000 square feet of new construction per year. This is a list of buildings that are permitted, planned, ready to go. They have fancy renderings and all that. But really what they're lacking is that significant commitment. So developers in Greater Portland and Maine, to speak of, they build to meet demand. I mean, this isn't the Boston market where you put up a 200,000 square foot building in Back Bay without any commitments, and it's full before they finish construction. Developers build to meet demand. So, there are a number of projects. These are 6 of the larger projects. I think there are 10 in total that technically could be done this year. There was an article in the paper a few weeks saying that we're going to have 10 new projects. But that really depends on the demand level. And as I mentioned earlier, there really isn't much of a demand here locally, especially on a smaller scale. Now, there are several large tenants in the market sniffing around for projects. But really maybe 3, 4, 5 of those. And so I can see a couple of these either getting that significant commitment next year, possibly breaking ground, but really only maybe 2 to 3, not all of these projects. It's really going to depend on the demand level moving forward. And this is a list of properties that, maybe it's a little too early to tell what type of development they're going to be. Are they going to contain office space is what I'm mostly focused on. Could be some residential. Some of these have been on here for a couple years. Some of them have just traded hands recently, which could prompt new construction, or the developer has talked about some sort of development. So I think it's important to keep an eye on these properties as well moving forward, at least not this year, maybe 2, 3 years down the road if that vacancy rate can stay low enough. And I think what's interesting is that the WEX project was not on my radar at all at this time. So I guess you never know what kind of surprises can happen moving forward. So to take a look at where we're going to go, I wanted to take the big picture. So I went all the way back to the 90s, 1997, when I guess the Spice Girls were really popular. You might remember that. So these are the direct vacancy rates over the course of the last 22 years. And what's interesting is going all the way back to 1997, we're at a very similar market right now in terms of where the vacancy rate is. We're on the same side of the market cycle with dropping vacancy rates. What's really crazy is when you look at 1998, 99, 2000, that vacancy rate dropping all the way to 1.6%. And as I mentioned earlier, they were averaging roughly 300,000 square feet of new construction during that time. So it's a very, very, very hot market. back in the late 90s. So is this what we can expect for Greater Portland over the next couple years? I don't think so. It was a very sharp drop, and when I'm reading the office market surveys from 1997, 1998, the big difference between then and now is just the level of demand. And in those office market surveys, they talked about, especially in downtown Portland, turning people away. There was such a high demand, multiple offers for leases, competing offers, which isn't happening right now. But that demand wasn't just a high demand, but it was also coming from out of state, which is an important fact, because a lot of the demand that we're seeing with some of those large companies sniffing around in downtown Portland for new construction is mostly local. And not local companies, but locally in terms of their offices. And sometimes they operate 2, 3 satellite locations, and so bringing those together under one roof it won't necessarily mean a positive net absorption. You're just taking maybe 20,000 square feet here and putting it into 40,000 square feet there. So moving forward a couple years to 2003, 2004, you see that vacancy rate was fairly flat for about 5 years. And I think that's probably more of what we can expect, at least for the near term. Really maybe 5% next year, maybe dropping a little bit. I don't see any big holes like a One Riverfront that if we filled, that would drop the vacancy rate by 1% by itself. But I also don't see any huge vacancies coming up on the near horizon. There are a few that I'm keeping my eye on for maybe later 2018. It'll be really interesting to see whether the demand can pick up to meet those vacancies. But I think overall remaining relatively balanced, at least for the near term. So what can we expect moving into 2018 overall? I do think that demand is going to stay relatively low. Right now, I just learned the other day that the unemployment rate in Portland is 2.4%. I read articles and talked with several large companies here in Portland that it's somewhat difficult to find well-qualified employees. And I think office users they're getting creative in terms of how to meet their growth. As I mentioned, there aren't great options earlier, but one of those would be the reorganization of the office space. And this is something I talked a lot about maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And I think that's finally starting to catch on. It takes a few years for these things to become commonplace and to really have an effect on the market. So that's certainly something that might be happening with that demand level that we're seeing. I do think that older, unimproved products, now this is both in Class A and Class B, are going to continue to struggle. So with those very few tenants out on the street, with that low demand, you really have to fight for those tenants. And they're going to want to see new lobbies, upgraded common areas, upgraded bathrooms, gyms, things like that. And that's really how to keep those buildings full and get those few tenants on the street. But some of those older products, you probably know what I'm talking about in downtown Portland, they're big. I think they're going to continue to struggle. There's going to need to be something big done there in order to change that around. And as I mentioned, new construction in downtown Portland and elsewhere as well, maybe 2 to 3 new buildings, maybe even 2 to 3 in downtown Portland, depending on whether any of these companies can pull the trigger. But what that's going to happen is possibly create more supply. Now, these buildings aren't going to be built in less than a year, but what's going to happen is you're going to start marketing those vacancies well in advance. So maybe helping out on the supply end in that 5,000 to 20,000 square foot range, which we're really lacking right now in all submarkets. And as I mentioned earlier, I do think the vacancy rate's going to remain relatively flat. What's going to be really interesting, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is whether the new construction that's happening now, what's going to happen with those vacancies maybe 2, 3 years down the road. So I don't see the vacancy rate going much lower, and after the next 12 months, possibly even going up a little bit, maybe into the 5 to 6% range. And then similar to last year, as a medical office market was certainly a driver, I think I see that happening again. Their clientele is only getting greater. Their services are needed more, opening up more branches and more offices. And so I certainly see that as a trend continuing in 2018. There are a couple projects right now that are under contract that could certainly create a domino effect within the market. But keep an eye on the medical office moving forward. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you to Jessica Estes and Michelle Peacock, and I'll be hanging around downstairs if you have any questions. Thank you.